Today we're joined by Anna Krylova, a freshly tenured associate professor of history at Duke University, and really someone who I think needs almost no introduction, so I'm just going to offer the barest bones of one today. She earned a PhD at Johns Hopkins University 10 years ago, and then went on to teach at South Carolina and then at Duke. Along the way, she has become, to what I'd say is more or less universal agreement, one of the most important voices among a post-Soviet generation of Russian historians. There you go. Her work has all sorts of, we could call them multivalent resonances in a range of different themes, approaches, and methods. This started even before she finished her PhD. All graduate students can take note of this. She published a very important article in the first issue of Kritika, a journal that just started to come out that very year in 2000, called The Tenacious Liberal Subject in Soviet Studies, which has become a fixture on prelims lists for PhD students and is likely to continue in that status for a long time to come. She's since gone on to explore with originality questions in intellectual history, the class instinct, rereading the collected works of Lenin, believe it or not. Ron should applaud this, right? And sort of finding new insights there. Cultural history on memory making and commemoration, and now, as you'll hear today, gender and military history in a talk that is presenting material from her also brand new book, congratulations, Soviet Women in Combat, where the mechanized arenas of combat in the Second World War create possibilities of thinking afresh about both women and combat in new ways. And that's what she'll be talking with us today. In short, she defines what it means to have a productively restless intellect. And I hope you'll join me in welcoming her to CREASE. Professor Krylova.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm overwhelmed, I have to admit. And thank you for coming. I will talk today about basically a particular aspect of my book, and I have been deciding and debating how exactly to enter into the story that and analysis that I'm working out in the book, which begins in the 1930s. The first part of the book is devoted to 1930s, to the young generation that to school in the Stalinist Russia, and it's called this kind of part is called Before the War. The second part was a big revelation for me as I was becoming more and more engaged with military history issues. The second part of the book is devoted just to mobilization, volunteer, and female and male volunteering for the front. So the whole second part is actually devoted, it's called Before the Front or On the Way to the Front, where I'm looking at how exactly men and women worked their ways into the army when they were not, and who participated in decision making, and how exactly the Soviet state actually was perceiving who is eligible for being recruited, and how women were entering into this state mobilization plans. And the third part is at the front, which deals with all this specifically in mixed gendered or intergendered spaces where men and women fought together in World War II on the Eastern Front. I guess I would just a second. So this is my book actually begins with introducing the female veteran, or in 1990. This is a picture from 1997, but if I would show you pictures from after 1997, you will see more and more female veterans among Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian veterans, because actually the young women who fought in World War II on the Eastern Front were the youngest cohort of people who actually were drafted. Most of the women were between late teens and mid-20s, and men, kind of the male part of the army comes from all different generations and gradually has been dying out. And the last veteran of World War II in Russia and Belarus and Ukraine is very likely to be a female combatant, because of not just because women live longer, but because they are the youngest in the cohort of those who went. So this this type of public manifestation, public performance of a female military identity began already in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So in the 50s, you already could see men and women walking on the streets of the Soviet cities, trying to kind of enact a military identity. And as I actually point out in my book, is that in the Soviet case, it was always like the veteran combatant identity was always split. It was always already presented as male and female. And I was very so before actually even the Victory Day becomes a formal Victory Day, this male and female soldiers also begin writing their memoirs and also kind of remembering what happened to them. And one of the So this I use a lot of sources, try to tell the story of how women kind of entered into high technologically demanding spaces of modern warfare in my book, and which come from archives, which come from different newspapers, from art, from film, from poetry, but I also use those memoirs which were written by female veterans and male veterans, specifically those who fought together. And this is just, I want to give you an example before I enter into the theme. One of the books, these books will be published in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, will basically an incredible kind of storm of writing and trying to remember. To me, what was very important is the terms, gender terms, in which those books were written, and how actually the history of the war would be narrated in those books which are written from spaces which were gender mixed, and those spaces, in comparison to those spaces, the kind of spaces on the front where men were the only ones who actually were fighting. So this is the book by Valentina Chudakova, which came out in mid-1960s, and she actually chose this particular illustration. So the books will be not only kind of offering a particular gendered narrative, which will be suggesting that men and women actually can relate to the front in a non-oppositional and non-contradictory way, where kind of the concept of the fact that the woman and the soldier do not constitute an inherently contradictory identity. So this language is very deeply interwoven into the text that I'm analyzing. But also this the sketches that these women are choosing, the sketches that women are asking to be drawn for them, are also very revealing. To me, this is a kind of a scene from the book where the main character, Valentina Chudakova, actually would be a platoon commander and then a company commander. So she will be at the level of a company commander. She will be in charge of 3 machine gun crews, male machine gun crews, basically in charge of about 25 men. And also she will have 3 officers under her command. And this is a scene from the combat, where she is presented as being basically clearly commenting to men who are part of her. So this is kind of the spaces where I will enter during the talk, trying to see what exactly happens at the front when women actually arrive in 1940. My focus will be on 1941, but I also will talk a little bit about post-41. So let me just. Ultimately, if I had a lot of time, my ideal beginning will be to start in 1930s and to look at 1930s cultural products, what exactly happened in 1930s, so that by 1941, young men and young women will be volunteering together. So they will be volunteering together, and this is, in my opinion, when those thousands of young women actually in June and July of 41 will be walking hurriedly, in a hurried manner, to conscription sites, or they will be walking to their party organization and young communist organizations, and they will be walking together with their brothers, husbands, and brothers and fathers, brothers, and husbands, but also with people that the young men that they don't know. This particular moment meant to me actually is kind of the beginning of the narrative, first of all, that women tell, and also for me, pointing how productive actually cultural and paramilitary spaces of Stalin society had been before the war to produce that kind of instinctive motion. Because most of the women who actually write about their decision making, why did they volunteer, what did they do, they actually use the trope of impulse or instinctive decision making. The narrative usually develops in a way that, the moment I heard that the war started, I immediately walked to the conscription site, or I immediately what this narrative is doing, it's omitting the process of thinking and reflecting on what one needs to do by foregrounding the idea that what needs to be done at the time of war in a society that had been preparing for World War II for basically 2 decades, and especially for the previous decade, is not really a question. You don't need to think about it. You actually the scripts of what needs to be done on the day of the war are very clear, and they're being enacted. And I would like to give you just one of the examples. if I don't know, like so. One of the examples of a young female who actually became a commander of artillery platoon. And then also company, Tamara Sychova. So Tamara Sychova was in her early 20s on June 19th. I'm just giving you an example of images of women in artillery, because there will be a lot of women who actually would be participating in anti-aircraft and fields as well as ground, and also just different types of artillery regiments. Tamara Sychova was on June 22nd, 1941, she worked as a pioneer organizer at a pioneer camp, not far from Lvov, so basically very close to the newly established military border between Germany and Russia, and Germany and the Soviet Union. So she was woken up she was woken up like most people on the border on the day by the roar of German planes which were flying to bomb Lvov, and within several hours, she basically was one of 12 volunteers that were marching to the nearest military post, which was luckily for them not very far away. So she was one of those women who was very close to the border on June 22nd and didn't have to go to any conscription sites. And among those 13 people, there were 2 women. She was one of them, and others, clearly 10 were men, and the whole group nominated her to be the leader of their volunteering kind of group, so that she will be talking to the military authorities. To me, and the way she describes what exactly she felt, she actually says, well, the only thing she could, like all the kind of she didn't remember what exactly her family was, she didn't remember her husband, she didn't remember that she had her daughter who was only 6 months old, that was with her parents. The only thing she says is that she constantly heard this inner voice that was saying, only to the front, только на фронт. And with this type of this description of the inner voice that is telling you that you are actually always going to that you know exactly where you're coming, that's a very typical trope. So what is interesting about Tamara, and for a lot of women of the time, is that actually that was like once they actually account military authorities, they would start thinking, like they would be asked questions like, why do you think that you should be going to the front? So there will be like reality check. Not everyone will be sharing their perceptions of this idea that I believe what Tamara is writing, she's suggesting this kind of identity for a woman where a woman who doesn't stand in opposition to combat, doesn't stand in opposition to violence, and in fact doesn't even stand, and at the same time doesn't reject motherhood, because from Tamara's point of view, she's going to the front to defend her mother, father, and her family, and at the same time also the country. So the way she actually starts her memoirs by a week before this volunteering moment, where she describes a controversy and discussion with her husband, who was completely opposed to her decision and wanting to be at the front. So there is this kind of starting by this conversation with her husband, she clearly identifies 2 ways of thinking, more than 2 ways, but at least in this case, 2 ways of thinking about womanhood, combat, and soldierhood, where her husband actually is operating in a very traditional mode of gendered identity, where he said that the woman should not be at the front, and she actually preferably should stay away from rifles, sniper rifles, and not just the front. When actually Tamara uses, that's my kind of attempt to give you a sense of what 1930s were like from Tamara's point of view. Tamara says, well, she basically kind of remembers how she was arguing with her husband, saying it was not without reason that I'm a young communist member. It was not without reason that the ideal that I have always aspired to was Ibaruri, Dolores Ibaruri, the woman revolutionary. I even called my daughter Dolores because in the name of this revolutionary. And then she would start actually even referring to the kind of films and images from this pre-war Stalinist culture, trying to kind of persuade her husband that combat and womanhood are actually completely the idea of a military calling is inherent to a particular kind of womanhood that she actually aspires to be. So she will refer to a movie from 1940, made 1940, about Russian Finnish war, which was not successful. It was not really it was not a military success for the Soviet Union, but a movie that was called Wartime Girlfriends. It's about basically women who are medics, and who, in this particular movie, they're presented as protecting soldiers and firing from sniper rifles. In Tamara's interpretation, she actually completely ignores the fact that the movie presents these women as emergency case. Like these women are fighting only firing their rifles because they need to protect the soldiers, and therefore they, like, the movie is suggesting much more kind of less radical interpretation of women in combat, only when it is an emergency, only when there is a need to kind of defend those who are wounded, then you can actually fight. From Tamara's point of view, she doesn't remember that. What she remembers, she only remembers this image of women firing at Finns, basically, in her perception, and how this woman is doing it in incredibly professional and elegant elegant manner from technical point of view, not elegant manner in the way. So she's referring to Stalin's culture, telling him, like, how can you disagree if actually, like, this we have all these inspirations, and this has become my inspiration too. And the last scene of her kind of before she goes to the front is the way when she talks about how she's changing into uniform. And this narrative is very much different from what usually gender historians kind of try to interpret in those moments of feeling sorry, abandoning your womanhood, and then embracing masculinity. For Tamara, actually, it's neither abandoning her womanhood and neither embracing her masculinity. She actually puts a military uniform because she's admitted into the army right away. She puts on her uniform and she looks at herself in the mirror and she says, all of a sudden, a soldier appeared, and and kind of my civil self just left, and I was very sorry to take off my beautiful dress, but that was what it was. So for me, it was very interesting, kind of the way she, even in the kind of in this moment of redressing, she actually doesn't contrapose soldierhood to her womanhood, but basically suggests that it is soldierly soldierly self is now coming out of her womanhood, not actually replacing it. And so it's a very harmonious sense of what a woman has to do. So in this concept, in the language of women who fought, they call themselves women soldiers. And this concept of women soldiers will be very much prevalently used in popular press, in central or formal press, in all recollections by these women. I also call these women female citizen soldiers, because these women ultimately just basically thought that they have the right to defend their motherland, but they were not aspiring necessarily to become professional military people. And what I explore in the book, I explore actually I explore two things. I mean, I explore several things, but the two things that I want to focus today is what kind of gender kind of notions and notions of masculinity, femininity, womanhood, and manhood need to be produced by 1941 so that women can kind of incorporate those, can argue their cases in 41 for entrance into the military. And then later after the war, they actually will use those notions to write the novels, autobiographical novels, and also autobiographies. And multiple collections of of volumes of essays and about the war, trying to rewrite the war in their terms. So this is one aspect. So I'm interested how exactly it is possible, kind of what kind of languages you need to have, what kind of systems of values, systems of meaning you need to have in order for a young teenager or like a teenager in her, either teenagers or women in their early 20s, so where they could actually neither reject motherhood but also not reject combat. Like, so you actually, so where exactly motherhood is located for Tamara, who is leaving her 6-month baby behind and goes to the front. So this is one aspect. Another aspect is I actually want to talk about what kind of combat these women and men are entering. They're entering what they think they're doing, they actually think that they are entering highly mechanized warfare. This is what the Stalinist society had promised to those women, that the war is going to be machine-driven, it's going to be the machines that are going to be deciding the outcome of the war. The infantry occupies kind of a secondary position. And so this image from 1936, when I look at it, I'm not necessarily focusing on Stalin and Voroshilov here. I'm looking at the amount of machinery that is actually portrayed here. It's very outdated machinery, by the way. 1936 it's kind of before the Soviets start producing really machines that could fight. None of the planes or tanks that are shown in this poster will be participating in World War II, and they will be destroyed. But they also will be replaced by 41. But the idea is that the next war is the war of artillery bombing, artillery sounds, about like dive bombers and fighter planes flying in the sky. Also of tanks for kind of going forward. This was basically kind of the promise that the generation that was very kind of the chosen generation to fight and to die for the socialist motherland was promised, and this is what these young women will be aspiring. So one of the things that Tamara, for example, who volunteered with the woman that I began, she immediately decides that though she's a certified sniper, she doesn't want to be a certified sniper, which for a lot of women will be exactly what they wanted. She wanted to become immediately artillery woman. She realized that artillery, long distance or short distance, will be something that's such a powerful way of actually kind of occupying the space of mechanized violence where everyone is looking at you, like if you're actually firing, and you can display your capabilities in a very powerful manner. So the kind of all the gender kind of controversies will be taking places behind some kind of machines. So Valentina would like to become, basically, I don't know any women who want to be combatants who would like to be just infantrymen. They all had aspirations that will be completely deeply connected to mechanized violence. And so Valentina Chudakova, with whose picture of her being actually wanted to be a machine gunner. And machine gunner will be a very popular occupation and image. A lot of women also would be already certified machine gunners by 41 because of the paramilitary training in the Soviet Union on equal footing, was put on equal footings. And a lot of women who would get to the front in 1941 and they will be actually taken into medical positions, which was kind of the easiest way for women to get in the beginning, where you would have, I mean, I will talk about controversies, how they were negotiating and talking exactly what. But those who would become medics, they actually will use the front, choosing what exactly, they never thought they would stay medics. They would choose what kind of military occupation they would like. One of them, Irina Levchenko, who would be a platoon commander of a tank, she would be a tank platoon commander, actually kind of created her image. She wanted first to be a pilot, and then when the first time she saw a tank in 1941, she was overwhelmed. She basically, let me just, I think I should read that. This is the way she's actually writing in the early 80s, but she's writing about her encounter with tanks. The moment I saw tanks, my dreams about planes became pale. Tanks. This is what one should dream about and strive towards. Nothing, it seems to me, could be compared with the great uplifting feeling that overcame a person nearby a tank. To fight in a tank division, to be a tanker, meant to me to be the main and decisive section of the meant to me to be at the main and decisive section of the front line. This is what I thought then, and this is what I think now. So. This kind of, that's why for me, why I'm very interested in this mechanized sites of mechanized warfare is because in those places, violence is used by men and women to construct very easy to construct their identities, where they can actually, in a very short period of time, thanks to their technical abilities, actually to display a particular skill that is obvious to everyone. Because if we look at, for example, machine gun position, a machine gunner is usually working when there is an kind of assault at the, for example, at Soviet positions, and when machine gunner is working, no one else is actually participating in. So everyone at the front is looking how the machine gunner is firing, and the particular firing signature, like every machine gunner has a firing signature or combat signature that is being identified and cannot be kind of detached or taken away from the person who just displayed it. So this is the moment. So I'm very interested in looking at modern violence as a productive part of modern identity and citizen soldierhood, kind of not in contradiction with notions where violence and actually destroys individuality, destroys human body, but actually in addition to look at World War II as a very complex space where actually both productions of identities were present. So let me just then go and describe to you how exactly this idea that how this mass volunteering of young women in 41 was taken. And what is very fascinating to me, and this is what I'm following different patterns, showing that there was no one single pattern how exactly men and women will be negotiating their entrance into the combat. A very important part aspect of this 1941 negotiation is that the state actually is ultimately missing from this is missing from those situations. The Soviet leadership didn't give any direct guidance to officers, either in conscription sites or in the military, exactly how to react to the female volunteers. And that was a peculiar reaction, where you actually have this mass movement of women trying to fight, where the government actually doesn't have a straightforward stand on what to do with these women. What this Soviet leadership is doing is they're not calling upon women to volunteer, but they also do not ban women from volunteering. And in those spaces of conscription sites or right at the front, that creates a space for kind of enforced independent decision making on the part of men, where actually male officers have to make decisions on their own. And it also gives a lot of space for women to argue why exactly they want to fight. So this is a moment of interpretation by men and women of what happened in 1930s in terms of their kind of discourses and practices of womanhood and manhood. So I want to give a few examples where I began with Tamara Suchova, whose husband was very much opposed to her particular desire to fight. Let me just... okay. And I want to actually kind of give you other scenarios which were also possible in 1941. This is Zoe. So since these women all come from the same generation and they all share kind of their common Soviet education, they also they're very much in the same age. So this is Zoe Medvedeva, who in 1941 was in her early 20s too, and she also volunteered. She volunteered in the south, not far from Odessa, when Odessa wasn't yet under assault, but she lived in Odessa, so she volunteered. And her narrative is that she constantly encountered different male authorities in the military that had very different reactions to her desire to become the machine gunner. She wanted to be a machine gunner. That was the only. She didn't want to be a medical orderly. She didn't want to be a telephone operator. She wasn't even interested in being a medical orderly right at the front. She wanted actually to be behind the machine gun. And she was immediately recruited into reserve army, a reserve regiment, where she was supposed to undergo training. And there was kind of the first officer who recruited her told her that you will be a cook or you will be a medic. But when she get into this reserve unit, she said, well, this is my path to the front is now completely open. I can get to any place I want. And she actually talks to the commander lieutenant, who will be the commander of her regiment, trying to tell him that she really wants to be a machine gunner and she wants to be part of his machine gun regiment. And there was this conversation where she describes how the lieutenant first told her, no, there is no way you can do it. And then she says, of course I can do it. I have a certificate. I have been dreaming to do that. I can show how I do it. So within the conversation, all of a sudden, this male officer said, oh, kind of why actually he stopped, he ran. I mean, he couldn't really tell him why. At some point he realized that he doesn't have any reasons to tell her why exactly she cannot become, and she tells me, oh, you're that kind of woman. And this concept of that kind of woman to me signals the idea is that basically by 1941 you don't have a kind of a kind of universal singular image of womanhood in the Soviet Union. So what actually the lieutenant was doing, lieutenant was testing Zoya, what kind of woman she was. So he would, and this is what actually a lot of soldiers, a lot of officers will do. They will offer traditional narratives about how about your family, what about your children, what about your mother, what about your father, and then after the woman actually will suggest, well, this is great, but I want to defend these people. The officer will immediately change the terms and saying, oh, I'm sorry, I kind of remembered, yes. So what the officer is doing, the officer is now begins to draw on all the images and all the discourses of the 1930s that actually presented women as very compatible with the combat calling. And it's very interesting because this type of switching is constantly present in female and male recollections, where you can clearly see that the text is written in two gender kind of registers, where there is one kind of traditional gender notions which are used and everyone recognizes them, and then there is an alternative kind of notions of gender, where gender is defined as a relationship between male and female activities, not necessarily put in opposition to combat, and all of a sudden the position of the soldier becomes like a split position between men and women, a shared space where all of, actually they can kind of they can enter, and that creates an enormous amount of space, opportunities for reinterpreting female relationship with their family members, not in abstract terms but in concrete terms, because women actually go to the front and they will be defending and constantly writing about that. So this is the experience that kind of this moment of recognition that Zoya Medvedeva received right away from her lieutenant, but then as she would enter, she will get closer to the front, she will constantly engage with different men who will basically will refuse to talk her language of alternative gender. They actually will kind of insist on more traditional notions. And to me, what actually it means is that in 1941, the Soviet Union has a situation where gender is a debatable open space. Actually, there is not really, like, you can really discuss it. You can argue. You can refer to traditional and call it bourgeois and patriarchal, or you can actually suggest there is this new Soviet notion of gender, and they will use the notion pol, Russian word for gender that was very used actively in 1930s, suggesting that that the idea that military violence is actually intrinsically opposed to female identity. This is just kind of a middle-class bourgeois prejudice. What a new notion of womanhood is when there is no intrinsic opposition, and there are multiple ways of combining how actually a woman can combine different parts of her existence in 1940, like different parts of required existence, motherhood, career-wise, and also combat. So a very fascinating. Let me kind of. Okay. So this is another. Kind of very fascinating, actually, before I go, this is also one of those cases where Anna Yegorova, who will become a dive bomber, like this is, oops, no, this one. She would fight on dive bomber that will be called Sturmovik, the most, I mean, like German troops called it Schwarze Death, Black Death, because this is one of the most advanced machines that Soviet army had, with incredible accuracy of bombing, of course. And she, so Anna Yegorova ultimately will become a second commander of a male regiment. So when Anna Yegorova, being a very accomplished pilot, actually was volunteering to become a military combat pilot, military pilot, she actually encountered this very interesting. She encountered an officer who was telling her, can you really imagine what it's like to fly a dive bomber? Can you imagine how basically incompatible you with that particular profession? And Yegorova describes this kind of, she becomes very outraged, and she asks the commander, like, do you really, why do you assume that being a medical orderly and dying right on the front under the bombing and dragging a wounded soldier with his gun, this is like feminine, and flying in a dive bomber protected by like being completely protected from any kind of, like, I mean, because like a dive bomber is a very secure weapon compared to being a medical orderly without any protection in the middle of between two fronts, between two front lines. So she would say, well, why exactly that is not feminine? So what she would be basically saying, getting to the very core of the problem, is that what really the traditional gender norms are requiring, they're not really opposing to female death in general. The traditional norms are actually that the Soviets, those Soviet men who are following those traditional norms of gender, they're opposing specifically to particular kind of death, to death in combat. So women can die as medical orderlies in huge numbers, but they cannot really die as a combatants. And of course they cannot die fighting a most advanced kind of heavy machines. So what happens at this moment, that we expect that the commander will continue arguing with Anna Yegorova, but in fact, what he does, he basically says, okay, you remind me of my daughter, who is exactly as crazy as you are, and fine. So he actually enlists her into dive bomber regiment, and she has one of the most accomplished careers in the Soviet army. And to me, that's also interesting from a gender point of view, is that actually you don't require an agreement. You don't need to have an agreement in society for diverse notions of gender actually to be present. You actually, like, what is required is that the officer recognizes the language which is being talked to him, which is not his language. So he recognizes that there is a completely different way of conceptualizing womanhood, conceptualizing kind of military calling, and he even he has a reference, he has a daughter of the same age who basically wants to do the same thing. So this is exactly what happens at the front lines, is when women actually, either they get there because male officers, either of a younger generation or the older generation, recognize themselves, either themselves in their desire, or they recognize this type of, they basically perceive this womanhood, this notion of womanhood compatible with combat as, impossible to argue against. Not knowing exactly what is it, like the next stage in female liberation or insanity. And a lot of them decide that this is actually the next stage in women's liberation. And this is a quote, actually. So when they get, what happens at the front is that kind of after this initial shock that a lot of men would experience, they would start actually, again, like this shock where like the traditional notions of gender hit them. They actually start thinking and reflecting back of what they had been witnessing in the 1930s, all the women snipers who won first prizes for their incredible skills, all the women pilots that were propagandized throughout the Soviet period, Stalinist period. So they would actually start remembering that, oh, I have a daughter who did this, or I have a sister who did this. So like all of a sudden, this one single person in 1940, like women in 41 will be entering individually into individual spaces because there will be no organized way of bringing them into the front. So like this one individual kind of female soldier all of a sudden becomes with multiple references that actually men actually remember, like, oh yes, she is like so the one singular person becomes a person with multiple connections to women of her own generation. And there is this process of basically it's a process of not acceptance, but there are different, like some I would say, like there are different ways of the relationship. Like you can object, but you actually cannot object if your officer decides that it's the right thing to do. Then you can have a doubt, but you are still not convinced that you should reject this women. Or some men were actually convinced that the women really, there is a type of womanhood actually that belongs to combat and actually can do combat better than some men. Especially those who didn't want to fight were very much in favor of women who wanted to fight, and they were very devoted members. So let me go back to this. To the scene, kind of. I think that the images are very important in terms of this is so there is also a very important part, like, what exactly the state is doing when this kind of entrance into combat is taking place, where women are rushing in. The state is taking very good record. Basically, all the journalists are rushing to the front and rushing to those conscription sites, taking photos and pictures, interviewing these women. So women volunteers immediately entered into the forefront of Stalinist coverage of the war. They take pictures, and that's why actually the archives are extremely well preserve this narrative of kind of, and through images, how women are recruited, how they actually take the oath, and how they and how they usually have a few men who are supporting their case. So this is a very typical kind of female volunteers of 1941, when the state actually doesn't really make any suggestions what to do with the young women who are volunteering. And usually these women will be either submachine gunners or machine gunners or snipers, because this is the immediate skills that they already acquired in 1930s. Most of women couldn't, in order to become an artillery woman or a pilot or a tanker, you actually require up to the year of training, and women will have to go through that. And this is also kind of, I'll just want to show you kind of one of the themes that I'm following through the book, saying, well, it's extremely difficult to see what the party line is, as in 1930s and also in 1941, because there are all this kind of, the party officials can never call upon women to volunteer, but the artists actually also are kind of fishing for what exactly needs to be done. And this is several posters. In this particular poster, you actually see a male and female at the forefront of volunteers, where you have a female actually holds a gun, and she also has a medical bag. So she actually has a gun and medical bag. The man only has a gun, but they're at the forefront, followed by by an army of other volunteers. But you also could see posters where women will be completely excluded, where actually the front will be presented as uniformly male, and they will sometimes be on the same page, or sometimes they will be in the same, like one issue after another. So this is an intermediary kind of poster where you see a female face right? It's a female face over there, but you also see different generations. You have a worker in the front. You have you have younger men and older men on both sides of the central figure, and then you have a female, and it's not clear what she's supposed to do at the front. So there is this ambiguity where. Like that's what I basically meant. Like kind of image-wise, if you don't read Pravda, if you don't read Komsomolskaya Pravda, you just look at posters which are being featured there and also multiplied throughout the Soviet Union. There are no clear messages. It looks like there is this multiplicity of female identities which are quite accepted. And this is a theme that comes from 1930s. This is exactly what happens in art, in film, in poetry, in literature, where like one novel will be suggesting that women should be going to the front, and another novel will be suggesting just the opposite, and they will be both praised as being the best examples of novels for the youth. So I would just kind of also want to kind of make a note that the way I perceive those once women arrive in combat, those kind of modes of recognition of the different type of womanhood and misrecognition of the different type of womanhood basically will be constantly replicated over and over again. But this peculiarity of 1941 is that basically if you could have a lot of arguments and discussions while you're volunteering, you cannot have that. You don't have any time to argue once you arrive at the front in 41, because the combat usually comes the next day. Sometimes it comes on the same day. So these women and men who are like either have some disagreements or they have some kind of understanding, or sometimes they completely opposed to being together. Like women opposed because they perceive this man outdated and completely patriarchal and disgusting, and men are of course opposed because they think that women, this is like extreme cases of those opposition, they still go into combat. Like they have to be in the combat basically next day, and they need to start working out their combat relationship. Like what exactly a social relationship of combat is going to be there, so that they actually ultimately they need to survive. Like that will be that's ultimate goal. And this is a very fascinating moment, because in this kind of mixture between when you start looking at micro cases, you realize that the historians, gender historians in particular, usually look at moments of contradictions and conflicts and favor the interpretation of negativity. Like men actually reacted negatively to female entrance into combat. The way I look at those situations, I look at them that actually what is happening there is there is a conversation. Sometimes it's a very negative conversation, but nevertheless they're speaking and they're trying to work out what exactly they're basically trying to work out the meaning of the soldier and whether the soldier can include the woman into itself, right? So once the combat begins, there are all these different scripts that these are the window of opportunities, in a sense, where you just have to face the combat together. So there will be very different ways men will react and women will work through. Women will often use those machines that they're fighting with as kind of stages of military performance, which after this kind of stage of military performance of your technical ability, this kind of fixes the female position in combat. But I'm more interested in those cases where, like, what exactly men do, those who actually were opposed to female presence. What they do, they engage into this right of pointless protection of women. They start. It's actually it's a very kind of touching mode of operation, because in the case of Zoe Medvedeva, her first commander who was opposed to her presence, like her last commander that ended up with her at the front, there were a number of them, actually was opposed to her being in his machine gun crew. So he put her, when he realized that the command, he cannot really get rid of her, so he puts her in her own crew, so she will be the third person in his own crew, just who was supposed to be by the machine gun and change the water. And he basically creates this image. And Zoe Medvedeva and those women of this generation, they're very carefully working, kind of describing those traditional modes of thought that men engage with, and they kind of make fun of them. So she says, well, he basically imagines that the front has the combat has several spaces. There are a space for women, that if you put her next to me, she cannot die. And there are a space right next to him. This is a space for men. This is the only place where death takes place. So, and she says, isn't it completely ridiculous? And she would describe how, like, the commander will not allow her to go and get water for the machine gun, because she said, well, I understand, according to the manual, I'm supposed to go and get the water, but I need to get out of the protective space into the trenches. And he clearly believes that it's again safer here than outside. And then she says, well, how is it safer inside than outside if basically all the bullets and all the fire is specifically targeted at the gun crew site. Like actually, so it is the most dangerous place actually to be next to that particular site. So she will be kind of she will be looking at this particular interesting part of like kind of how men would be how they will be trying to protect, but also there will be a lot of men who will be actually describing their own, like I work with a lot of male kind of following these different forms of available languages and available modes of imagination, where men actually describe their encounters with women and their gradual kind of like ability to think about them as not traditional women only because there is a cultural capital of the 1930s that they can draw upon. So, and also there will be, so they will, after a while, when women, after like women, the first or second time in combat, men would be immediately like remembering, oh, there is this Anka machine gunner from 1930s, which is a main character in a very famous Soviet movie, Chapayev. So they will be referring to those notions like, oh, she's like Anka the machine gunner. And that kind of explains the whole thing. Or they would, and there will be also very creative modes, like the men will be start drawing on kind of world cultural elements, which actually are presenting women in combat as a coherent construct. They will be talking about. They will start call women Athens, or Diana the Hunter. So they will be like kind of so they will be like kind of digging up all possible interpretive ways of explaining to them what exactly is happening, and they will be both Soviet based and also actually the kind of world based cultural capital that they will be exposing how actually. To me, it was like, there are so many other ways to think about women in combat and motherhood, and that actually kind of world history preserves that this is the moments where it becomes very much kind of used. And there will be, to me, but it was very interesting, there are always moments of creativity that open up in combat, where men, after several months of being in combat with women, will start actually coming up with their own interpretations. And they sometimes, like gender historians usually presume that only cultural, that biological terms usually are kind of regressive and they cannot possibly serve of womanhood, but there is nothing intrinsically wrong with biological explanations of gender differences actually in the way like historically. And so I have several examples of the way men actually trying to explain why women are in combat through hereditary terms and biological terms, where they will be kind of reaching out to notions of Amazons, suggesting that Amazons actually were kind of living on this territory of southern Russia, which is, and they will be suggesting, they will be developing this train of thought, saying, well, actually, what is really happening is that these women must be blood relatives of those women, and therefore, if they're blood relatives, there is absolutely no way to reject these women from combat because this is kind of the Soviet womanhood. This new Soviet womanhood is deeply connected to those genetic roots of the early Russia. And in this way, on one hand, it's very kind of but it's very interesting how many interpretive possibilities that I'm just touching on several that appear the moment you create those spaces where it's not only abstract notions of gender and gender equality that are being kind of repeated over and over again, but actually you have spaces where you can use this language and you can use this language within social relations, and you are creating new social relations. I want just to end with one particular social relationship because I started with motherhood when. I'm kind of one of the military officers that admitted, just let me show. Oh, I'm going in the wrong direction, sorry. Who admitted Maria Baida to become a submachine gunner in his particular regiment. So Maria Baida became the hero of the Soviet Union, and this is a picture after the war when she was interviewed on the radio about her military career. So this particular officer who admitted Maria, he also had this moment of looking at her in traditional terms, but then misrecognizing and recognizing her a different kind of womanhood. So he describes this case where in combat, those who actually can kind of preserve calmness and kind of enact calmness for those who are losing their nerves, they become these individuals on which people get cathected in a sense. So Maria Baida, those officers or soldiers who actually could act calmly in a state of incredible kind of attention would be the ones that people will get invested in emotionally. So Maria Baida actually had several soldiers who only agreed to fight with her. because she actually had, partially because, so she actually stood the fire extremely well, and she could actually, she just didn't get disoriented in cases of major pressure. So there will be this man who will be basically calling her a mother, and will be only fighting with her, and they will agree only to go to combat in assault with her, because she actually represented to them the guarantee of their safety. So and it is it's a very interesting kind of imposition, kind of changing the notions of motherhood, where motherhood becomes someone who's taking care of you, but at the same time is taking care of you in a deathly situation, and So in this type of motherhood will be very essential for constructing Soviet female commanding identity, where actually, like, there will be fathers and mothers in Soviet officer corps. Fathers will be male commanders, and mothers will be female commanders. And I also look at how at the front, like the different spaces of military culture appear, which are kind of more female, some of them mixed, and others are male. So let me just end with some conclusions before we go to the question and answer period. So I have there are three things that I would like probably to mention about the Soviet case. Number one, what is to me fascinating is actually how malleable indeed gender norms are. That basically within the course of one generation, if you actually create a certain certain educational system that the Soviets actually created in the 1930s, and also certain paramilitary training and certain kind of discourse of gender equality, which in the Soviet case was an invitation to think differently. Whatever you want, you need to think differently from bourgeois notions. You have to come up with these differences on your own. We don't know what it's going to be, but you have to be different from your parents. So this type of once the state, whether it's a totalitarian state or it's, which is a problematic term anyway, especially after all the contradictions that the Soviets actually had in their popular culture and couldn't fix it, once the state actually makes an effort, the change in perceptions of what's considered to be normative and what's considered to be universal, what's considered to be appropriate, actually changes remarkably fast. And in the Soviet case, we basically have this change within one generation, and then in later, this change will turn back, also because the educational system in the Soviet Union will change. So this is kind of one aspect. Another aspect I also wanted to point out is that I look at this particular kind of a moment of I want to also point out that in the Soviet Union, this particular experience and remembering of this experience actually basically has taken the whole time of the Soviet period. It began in the 1930s when, like in schools, in shooting ranges, and also in literature and art, it actually acquired the social relations and new identities at the front. And then after the war, women start writing, men and women start writing about their experiences, trying intentionally rewrite what exactly considered to be a normative military history and how military identities are being constructed. So, and lastly, what I wanted to mention is that it's also very important to look at the Soviet case comparatively, and this is what I devote quite a lot of time in my book, because what is happening in the Soviet Union in different forms actually has already taken place in Great Britain. Already in the early 30s, Great Britain makes a decision to take women into anti-aircraft brigades, and women actually do participate in combat in Great Britain. Americans get very interested by the British example and also have experimental regiments with the women and men, mixed batteries but Americans never utilize those women because they misperceive they perceive the popular voice of the people being much more conservative than I believe it was. So the by 1940s, basically not only in Russia but actually in all European countries, you actually have men and women who are thinking about the war in very different terms and very much beyond this traditional oppositional ways of opposing masculinity and femininity in relation to combat. So you can actually see this, and it's very interesting how different national experiences are narrating this experience of like how honest they are, what is happening. In the Soviet case, this experience creates a new category, woman soldier, which as I mentioned actually yesterday in our seminar, that the woman soldier becomes a category of identification by 1943 that is used in Pravda and Komsomolskaya Pravda on a regular basis. These are two major central newspapers in the Soviet Union. And the journalists actually, by 43, have to identify whether they're talking about men or women. They have to say woman, женщина-солдат, or мужчина-солдат, woman soldier or man soldier. And to me, that actually kind of symbolically captures this breakdown of association of soldierhood with masculinity completely. Once you have to identify who it is, you actually have you have an alternative discourse of soldierhood in the center of Soviet public discourse. Thank you.